Who was Jim Jones?
During the 50s and 60s, Jones had been largely known in Indianapolis, Indiana as a charismatic church leader. He was even known as being against racism, which was an even bigger issue than it is now. In 1955, he had established the infamous People's Temple. The People's Temple had combined Christianity, communism, socialistic ideologies. Jim Jones was extremely paranoid as a person. He had also believed in over-abusing his power that he had over his followers. He had been sexually active with many of his followers and foresaw the beatings of others. His followers were to remain celibate unless their father needed to satiate his own needs. He attracted members through the promise of miracles. Those who weren't as hardcore in his beliefs fled or died. He established a psychological hold over many of his members through isolation, intimidation, humiliation, spying, and brainwashing. Husbands and wives were forbidden to experience coitus, and their children were to inform on them. Those who disobeyed and thought Jones's jurisdiction was not of God or of any other mystical figure were publicly shamed and beat. Jones adopted 3 Korean children, a Negro child, and had 2 white children whom were his own. The People's Temple Agricultural Project was supposed to be the religious group's promised land. In 1977, almost 1,000 Americans had moved to Jonestown, as it was called, hoping to create a new life. When U.S. Representative Leo J. Ryan of California and 3 journalists attempted to leave after a visit to the community, reports claim that Jones had seemed a madman, and many of his followers fled with Ryan. His plane was shot down. Jones's followers, fearing that negative reports would destroy their communal project. Jones was so paranoid that he had taken his followers' monies and passports so that they could not leave. He also had them all rehearse a mass suicide which would be enacted for real later on November 14th, 1978. He then laced the grape Flavorade, a competing brand for Kool-Aid, cyanide. He made a huge speech of how much he loved his followers and regretted having to do this. He even boldly called it a revolutionary suicide. As a young boy, he had always been a churchgoer, which may have led him to becoming a minister. And he had been nothing more than ignored by his World War I retiree dad, and his mom was always away at one of her many jobs. He, being the observant young boy he was, however, had managed to preach to many of the teens in the neighborhood. His neighbor had taken Jones to her church many times. All the while, Jones had been going on his own spiritual religious quest around the age of 10. According to the Atlantic's article called Drinking the Kool-Aid, a survivor remembers Jim Jones. A woman known as Terry Buford O'Shea was 19 years old when joining the People's Temple during 1971. O'Shea had been homeless while Jones pulled her into his arms and led her to his community. O'Shea gladly went with him to Jonestown. After all, if she didn't like the People's Temple, she could always leave. At least that's what had been thought at the time. Her memory of Jonestown are rather complex. The people worked hard to create this utopian-like society. Jones himself had even been working hard to help with civil rights. The majority of his followers had been African American, and 1/3 of them had been children. O'Shea claims that Jones's idealism had been a large part of why he so dangerous. He fed the people's fears and promised to create a rainbow family. His charismatic nature had been enough to recruit hundreds of people to a South American jungle, then cut ties between the real world and them. O'Shea had escaped only 3 weeks before the massacre and had published a collection of poems and photographs known as the Jonestown Lullaby. Jones described the rehearsal for the mass suicides as white nights. She realized what this meant, and she had explained in the book that Jonestown is not a curiosity, but rather a cautionary tale for everyday people. I'm now going to interview Miss Stacy. Miss Stacy had said that she remembers Jonestown, and that there were all races together. The people's family members were getting worried about the members of the cult. This led to the government getting involved. Most of them died, however. Some people managed to escape Jonestown, however. Me and Miss Stacy had listened to the Jonestown death recording from just the first lines that Jim Jones spoke.